Judge Margaret Lambert was never late to the courtroom. In 30 years of practicing law and 15 years as a federal judge, she had earned a reputation as an iron lady. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, not a minute later, she always took her seat at the judge's table. Today, however, was different. The call came at 8:30 as she was reviewing the files on a securities fraud case. Her husband's number popped up on the phone screen, and Margaret felt slightly annoyed. Robert knew she was preparing for a hearing. "Darling, something terrible has happened." His voice shook. "It's Emily. The police just called. They found her dead in her apartment." Judge Lambert froze. The room suddenly seemed icy cold. "What did you say?" she interjected, though she heard every word perfectly. "Emily is dead. I don't know anything else. I'm going there now. I'll send you the address." 40 minutes later, the judge's black sedan pulled up outside a neat apartment building in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. Police cars with blinkers, yellow fence tape, gawkers with cell phones, just like the court cases she'd tried over the years. Only now, it was happening in her life. A skinny officer blocked her path at the entrance. "Ma'am, this is a crime scene. You can't—" "I'm Margaret Lambert, federal judge for the Southern District of New York. Emily Lambert is my stepdaughter." Her tone was unobjectionable. The officer hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. "Detective Morrison is upstairs in apartment 214, he muttered. Margaret climbed the stairs, each step difficult. Emily, only 22 years old, Robert's daughter from his first marriage, a law student, following in her stepmother's footsteps. There had never been much intimacy between them, but the relationship had remained even, respectful. Robert was already there, sitting on a chair in the hallway, head down on his hands. When he saw his wife, he rose and silently embraced her. Margaret felt his shoulders shake with silent sobs. "Mrs. Lambert?" A low male voice was heard. Margaret turned around. Standing before her was a tall man with broad shoulders, tired eyes, and stubble that spoke of long hours of work. "Detective James Morrison, homicide." He held out his ID. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Homicide?" Margaret interjected. "So it wasn't an accident?" "It's too early to tell," Morrison said evasively. "But the circumstances of the death raise questions. We're waiting for the medical examiner." "I want to see her." Margaret's voice was firm. Morrison looked her straight in the eye. "Are you sure? It could be traumatic." "Detective, in 30 years of practicing law, I've seen pictures of hundreds of murder victims. I want to see my stepdaughter." He nodded and led her into the apartment. The small living room was tidy but with obvious signs of student life. Stacks of law books, a laptop, a half-empty cup of coffee. On the coffee table were 2 glasses and an open bottle of red wine. Emily lay on the couch as if she had fallen asleep. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, her blonde hair strewn across the pillow. Only the unnatural posture and the bluish tint of her lips suggested that she wasn't dreaming. "When did this happen?" Margaret asked, keeping her composure. "Tentatively last night, between 8 and 11, Morrison replied. "One of the glasses was used. The other was clean. Looks like she was expecting someone." "Cause of death?" "Not determined yet, but there's no sign of forced entry or struggle. Could be something in the wine. The lab will have the answer." Margaret looked around the room. There were pictures on the mantelpiece. Emily with her father, Emily at graduation, Emily with her classmates. Not one with her stepmother. "Who discovered the body?" she asked. "A neighbor, Mrs. Donovan. Emily was supposed to give her the notes in the morning, didn't show up and didn't answer her phone. The neighbor had a spare key. At that moment, Robert appeared. When he saw his daughter, he cried out and collapsed to his knees beside the sofa. Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. "She should have moved in with us," he moaned. "I've suggested it dozens of times." "Mrs. Lambert," the detective took the judge aside. "Do you know if Emily was seeing anyone? Did she have a boyfriend? Close friends?" "We weren't that close," Margaret admitted. "Emily was always withdrawn, focused on her studies. Perhaps her father knows more." "I'll interview him a little later," Morrison nodded. "We have information that her behavior has changed recently. Neighbors have noted that she's been tense, often coming home late, spending a lot of time out of class." "What do you mean by that?" Margaret frowned. "I don't know yet," Morrison shrugged. "As a federal judge, you must be interested in a quick investigation?" "As the victim's stepmother, detective, Status has nothing to do with it. Of course, he nodded. Just one more question. Were you and your husband home all night last night? Yes, she answered without blinking an eye. We had dinner, then worked on some paperwork. I was preparing for the hearing. Robert was working on company business. What time did you go to bed? Around 11. She looked at the detective. Are these standard questions, or am I already a suspect, detective? Standard procedure, Your Honor, Morrison replied calmly. We're interviewing everyone close to the victim. An hour later, the apartment was filled with CSIs. Margaret persuaded her husband to go home. There was no point in staying here. Before leaving, she approached the detective. I want to be kept informed of every step of the investigation. As you wish, he replied, but I must warn you, these cases can take unexpected turns. I've been in court for 15 years, Detective Morrison. It's hard to surprise me. He nodded, but something in his gaze made her wary. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 2 days later, the lab confirmed Emily had been poisoned. Her blood contained a rare toxic substance that mixed easily with red wine, masking the bitter taste. Death was quick, within half an hour of consumption. Morrison sat at his desk, studying the preliminary report. Something wasn't adding up here. A girl from a well-to-do family, a future lawyer, no obvious problems or enemies who would want to kill her. Anything interesting? Asked Detective Ramirez, his partner, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. It's a strange case, Morrison said. Stepmother's a federal judge. Father owns a construction company. The victim herself is a law student with excellent grades. At first glance, perfect family. At first glance, no one gets killed, Ramirez said. I interviewed neighbors and classmates. They all say the same thing. Quiet, reserved, responsible. But in the last month, something's changed. A friend said Emily was working on some project, but she wouldn't tell anyone about it. Did you check her computer? Techs are still working on it, passwords, encryption. But they found something interesting in her paper notes. Morrison pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a sheet of handwritten notes. Look, he pointed to an entry at the bottom of the sheet. Cortez case. Check the connection. Cortez? Ramirez frowned. The name sounded familiar. That's what I thought too. Ran it through the system. 3 years ago, Ryan Cortez was convicted of financial fraud. Got a surprisingly lenient sentence. Only 2 years instead of the standard 5 to 7. And who was the judge? Morrison looked meaningfully at his partner, Margaret Lambert. Ramirez whistled. That's an interesting coincidence. Too interesting, Morrison nodded. I've requested the Cortez case file. You think there's a connection? I don't know. But Emily was a law student, interested in jurisprudence. Maybe she was just looking into her stepmother's cases. Or she found something she shouldn't have, Ramirez added quietly. Morrison gathered up the papers and stood up. I'm on my way to meet the Lambert family. I want to talk to them again, now that I know about the poison. The Lambert mansion in the upscale Upper East Side neighborhood looked imposing. 3-story neo-colonial building, immaculate lawn, security cameras. Morrison was met by the housekeeper and escorted into the spacious living room, where Robert and Margaret Lambert were waiting. Detective? Margaret stepped up to meet him. Any news? Yes, Mrs. Lambert. Talk screen confirmed the poisoning. It's a rare substance, not something you can buy at the store. Robert turned pale. So it's definitely murder? Without a doubt. Morrison nodded. Mr. Lambert, did your daughter have any enemies? Maybe trouble with someone? No, never. Robert shook his head. Emily was. She always avoided conflict. Had she seemed troubled lately? Maybe mentioned some project she was working on? The couple looked at each other. She called about a week ago, Margaret said slowly. She said she'd found an interesting topic for a term paper, something to do with economic crime jurisprudence. Did she mention the Ryan Cortez case? Margaret tensed slightly, but her face remained impenetrable. No, I don't recall that. Why? We found the name in her notes, Morrison replied, watching the judge's reaction carefully. I've handled hundreds of cases, Detective. I can't remember everyone. Of course, Morrison nodded. But this case is quite remarkable. You gave Cortez an unusually lenient sentence. If you have specific questions about my professional judgment, Detective, I'm prepared to answer them in the presence of my attorney, Margaret said coldly. No such questions yet, Morrison stepped back. I'm just trying to understand why Emily was interested in this case. Perhaps it's part of her studies, Robert suggested. She often analyzed court decisions for practice. Morrison nodded and changed the subject. One more question. Did Emily have access to rare chemicals, maybe through the university? Not that I know of, Robert answered. She studied law, not chemistry. What about you, Mr. Lambert? Your company works with building materials. We build homes, detective, not chemicals, Robert replied sharply. What exactly was the substance found? Margaret asked. I can't divulge those details at this stage of the investigation, Morrison replied, but it's a rare compound, not readily available. Margaret pressed her lips together. Detective, I insist that we investigate as quickly as possible. If necessary, I'm prepared to use my connections to bring in additional resources. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Lambert, but let us do our job, Morrison said firmly. We're moving as fast as we can. Before leaving, the detective asked permission to see Emily's room at her parents' house. Margaret escorted him to the second floor. She hasn't lived here for a long time, the judge said as she opened the door. She'd come up occasionally on weekends or holidays. The room looked almost untouched. A bed, a desk, bookshelves, no personal belongings, as if it were a guest bedroom, not her daughter's room. When had she moved into her apartment? Morrison asked. 2 years ago, when she went to law school, Margaret replied. She wanted her independence. Robert was against it, but I supported her decision. When I was her age, I wanted to be independent too. Morrison scrutinized the room, opened several drawers, looked under the bed. In the far corner of the closet, he found an old cardboard box. May I? He pointed to the find. Margaret nodded. Inside were school notebooks, a drawing album, some children's books, and a photo album. Morrison began to look through it. Snapshots of little Emily with her mother, school pictures, family holidays. On the last few pages, he noticed something odd, a few places where photos had clearly been torn out. Do you know what was on these pages? He asked, pointing to the blank spaces. Margaret frowned. I have no idea. I've never looked through her albums. Morrison closed the box. Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Lambert. I'll contact you if I have any further questions. Already in the car, the detective called Ramirez. The text cracked the password on Emily's computer? Not yet, but there's an update on the Cortez case. He got out of prison 8 months ago. And guess where he's working now? A non-profit organization that rehabilitates ex-convicts. The organization gets grants from the Justice for All Foundation. So, Margaret Lambert is chairman of the board of trustees of that foundation. Morrison whistled. Interesting. Check his address. I want to talk to him. Over the next few days, Morrison immersed himself in the investigation. He studied the Cortez case, interviewed his former colleagues, checked the Lambert family's financial history on the surface. Everything looked perfect. A respected judge, a successful businessman, a model family. But something was bugging him. On the evening of the 5th day of the investigation, technicians finally cracked the security on Emily's laptop. Morrison got the message and immediately went to the lab. What's up? He asked as he entered the room. Nothing much at first glance, the technician replied. Study materials, essays, the usual student stuff. But there is one strange folder with photos. He opened a hidden directory, protected by a separate password. Inside, Morrison saw dozens of photographs. They showed Margaret Lambert in a cafe on a park bench, entering an inconspicuous building. And in every picture, there was a man beside her. Who's that? The technician asked. Morrison gazed into the man's face and said slowly, Ryan Cortez. Ryan Cortez's case file lay on Detective Morrison's desk, open to a page with a picture of the defendant. A 33-year-old man with piercing dark eyes stared directly into the camera, not a shadow of remorse or fear. Morrison turned the page, studying the 3-year-old material. Financial fraud on a large scale, stock manipulation, document forgery, damages estimated at $2 million, the detective read, making notes in his notebook. By all accounts, Cortez should have received at least 7 years in prison, but Judge Margaret Lambert sentenced him to just 2 years with the possibility of parole. The rationale was vague. given the mitigating circumstances and the lack of direct violence in the offense. "What did I miss?" Morrison muttered, looking through the paperwork. Ramirez entered the office with 2 cups of coffee. "Found something interesting," she said, placing 1 cup in front of her partner. Cortez was out on parole after 14 months. Model behavior, active participation in prison rehabilitation programs. And here's the interesting thing. He met with his lawyer 6 times in the month before his parole hearing. Standard procedure. Morrison shrugged. "Yeah, but there was a change of counsel. Ronald Green, one of the best in the city, replaced his court-appointed defense attorney. His services cost thousands of dollars an hour." Morrison raised an eyebrow. Where did Cortez get the money? His accounts were frozen. "Exactly," Ramirez nodded meaningfully. "Someone paid for Green's services. And guess who was in the same class with him at Harvard? Margaret Lambert? Bingo. They were even in the same student body." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Connections," he stretched out. The judge had used personal connections to get Cortez a good lawyer. The question is why? Could there be something between them? Morrison shook his head. Too obvious and risky for a federal judge. There's got to be something else. He went back to looking at the files on Emily's computer. In addition to the photos, there was a folder of documents, copies of the Cortez case file, transcripts of court proceedings, articles on similar crimes with sentencing analysis. Emily did her research, comparing the Cortez case with similar cases. She definitely suspected something wrong, the detective muttered. But what was it? Another folder contained photographs taken in various locations, a cafe, a park, the entrance to an inconspicuous building. All of them showed Margaret and Cortez talking, sitting side by side, sometimes exchanging what looked like documents. "When were these pictures taken?" Morrison asked the technician. "According to the metadata, within the last 3 months. The most recent one is from the week before Emily died." "She's been following them," Morrison said thoughtfully. "Collecting evidence of their meetings. But why?" "Maybe she was planning blackmail," Ramirez suggested. "A judge's personal relationship with an ex-convict is a national scandal. Or she was preparing to expose it," Morrison countered. "She's a future lawyer. She was studying ethics. Maybe she was going to go to the Judicial Ethics Commission." He closed the folder and stood up. "I'll go to the university, talk to Emily's classmates and professors. Someone should know what she was working on. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." Columbia Law School greeted Morrison with the silence of the libraries and the noise of the student corridors. Young people with piles of books and laptops hurried to class. Professor Helen Coleman, Emily's coursework supervisor, seemed genuinely saddened by the student's death. "Emily was one of the most promising students on the course," she said, offering Morrison tea. "Brilliant analytical mind, excellent grasp of legal principles." "Professor Coleman, do you know what she's been working on lately?" Morrison asked, dismissing the tea with a gesture of his hand. Officially a term paper on the ethical aspects of the judicial system. She chose conflict of interest in federal case law, standard enough for a sophomore. And unofficially? The professor faltered. "About a month ago, she came to me with questions about the procedure for filing a complaint with the Judicial Ethics Commission. Said it was for a hypothetical case. I explained, but something about her insistence made me wary." "Did she mention specific names? The Ryan Cortez case?" "No, detective. She was very careful with her wording. But I do know that her stepmother is a federal judge. And yes, that day, Emily asked about the consequences for a judge who has a personal relationship with a convicted person after sentencing." "And what are those consequences?" "From disciplinary action to suspension and criminal prosecution, depending on the circumstances." The professor looked directly at Morrison. "Do you think she found something compromising about her stepmother?" "Perhaps," the detective replied evasively. "And how did she feel about her stepmother? Did she talk about her?" "Rarely. But there was a sense of tension. Emily chose law partly because of her stepmother's influence, but she sought to step out of her shadow. She had once mentioned that Margaret Lambert saw the closed eyes of the statue of Themis as a convenient metaphor. Sometimes justice must turn a blind eye to certain things. Morrison made a note. Who other students were close to Emily? Jessica Pack, they worked on a few projects together. And then there's Michael Stone, They dated for a while. In the student cafeteria, Morrison found Jessica, a petite Asian woman with a short haircut and eyes red from crying. She reluctantly agreed to talk. "Emily was my best friend," Jessica said quietly. "I can't believe she's gone." "Did you know what she was working on lately?" the detective asked cautiously. "Some kind of special project. She called it personal research. She became very secretive, always running off with her camera. I thought..." The girl hesitated. "I thought she was investigating her boyfriend again." "Michael Stone?" "Yeah. They broke up 3 months ago. Emily suspected he was cheating on her, so she tracked him down with another girl. She had a knack for, finding information." "Did she talk about the Ryan Cortez case?" Jessica frowned. "No, but... Wait, she was actually asking me about an article we were studying in ethics, about judges having informal relationships with former defendants. Said it was an interesting legal mishap." "When was this?" "About 2 weeks before she died. She seemed very agitated. I offered to help, but Emily refused. Said it was too sensitive." As he left the university, Morrison felt a picture slowly emerging. Emily had discovered the connection between Judge Lambert and Cortez, was gathering evidence, perhaps planning an appeal to the Ethics Commission. For Margaret Lambert, such exposure would have meant the end of her career, possibly imprisonment. Is that motive enough for murder? Definitely. But Morrison had no direct evidence, only circumstantial evidence and conjecture. He decided to continue his surveillance of Lambert while looking into any connection between her and Cortez. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 days after the discovery of the photographs, Morrison organized a surveillance of Margaret Lambert. The judge led a normal life. Court, official events, home, no suspicious meetings or phone calls. "She knows we're watching her," Ramirez remarked, reviewing the surveillance reports. "Too exemplary behavior." "We need to dig deeper," Morrison agreed. "Check her financials for the last 3 years. Any unusual transactions, donations, investments. Already on it. And what's interesting is that the Justice for All Foundation, where she chairs the Board of Trustees, has given grants to 5 nonprofit organizations in the last 2 years. One of them, New Beginnings, is where Cortez works. Coincidence? Maybe. But 80% of New Beginnings' budget comes from the Lambert Foundation. And guess who founded that organization? Ronald Green, the same lawyer who represented Cortez at his parole hearing. Morrison whistled. The circle closes. Lambert gives a lenient sentence, secures an expensive lawyer, then funds the organization where Cortez works. We need to talk to him. "Be careful," Ramirez warned. "If they're in cahoots, he could tip off Lambert." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Morrison replied. "Let them be nervous, make mistakes." The New Beginnings office was located in a renovated warehouse building in Brooklyn. Spacious, open-plan space, young employees at computers, motivational posters on the walls. Ryan Cortez occupied a small office in the back of the office. "Detective Morrison?" He stepped up to meet his guest. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Cortez looked confident and relaxed. Stylish suit, neat haircut, firm handshake. Nothing like the photo in the police file. "Investigating the murder of Emily Lambert," Morrison said, wasting no time with pleasantries. Cortez's face remained unruffled. "I'm sorry to hear about her death, but I don't see how I can help. I didn't know Miss Lambert. Did you know her stepmother, Judge Margaret Lambert?" Minimal pause before answering. "Of course I do. She's the chairwoman of the foundation that funds our organization. We've crossed paths at official functions." "Just official events?" Morrison pulled a photograph Emily had taken out of the folder. Lambert and Cortez sitting in a cafe, leaning toward each other. Cortez looked at the picture and shrugged. "We sometimes discussed projects informally. Nothing out of the ordinary. What about the fact that she was the one who tried your case and handed down a surprisingly lenient sentence?" "The judicial system sometimes works unpredictably," Cortez replied dryly. "If you have specific charges, Detective, I'd like to hear them in front of a lawyer." "No charges yet," Morrison backed off. "Just gathering information. Did you know Emily Lambert was spying on you and her stepmother? Photographing your meetings?" A slight shadow of concern ran across Cortez's face. "No, I didn't. Why would she do that?" That's a good question. Maybe she discovered a connection between the two of you? A connection that goes beyond a professional relationship? Cortez is standing up. I don't think we have anything further to discuss, Detective. If you have any more questions, feel free to contact my attorney. One last thing. Morrison stood up as well. Where were you on the evening of the 22nd, between 8 and 11? At the Justice for All Foundation charity dinner. There were about 100 witnesses there, including your boss, the police commissioner. Morrison nodded. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Cortez. The detective turned around at the door. You know, there's one thing that's been bugging me. Emily was poisoned with a rare substance you can't buy on the street. That would require special connections, or access to law labs that examine evidence in complex cases. Cortez didn't react, but Morrison saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. Have a good day, Mr. Cortez, the detective added, and left the office. Getting into his car, Morrison didn't leave right away. He watched the building, and exactly 12 minutes later, he saw Cortez leaving the office in a hurry, looking around. Ramirez, Morrison called to his partner. Cortez had just left the office. He looks agitated. I think he's on his way to Lambert's. Surveillance team at the courthouse says the judge is in session till 6 p.m., so he's going to her house or he's waiting until after the hearing. Keep me posted. Morrison was right. At 6:30, Margaret Lambert left the courthouse and headed for the underground parking garage. The surveillance team reported that she didn't go home, but headed toward Central Park. She stopped in a quiet neighborhood, parked, and entered an inconspicuous restaurant called Bella Noche. 10 minutes later, Cortez arrived there as well. Morrison, having received the message, immediately drove to the restaurant. He parked on the opposite side of the street and took a position from which he could see the table by the window where Lambert and Cortez were sitting. They looked anxious. The conversation was tense. The judge raised her voice several times. Cortez put his hand soothingly on her wrist. Morrison couldn't hear their words, but watched their body language, their facial expressions. 40 minutes later, they left the restaurant and headed for Lambert's car. Once inside, they continued talking for almost another half hour. The detective took several photographs through a telephoto lens, evidence of their meeting. Finally, Cortez got out of the car and, catching a cab, drove away. Lambert remained sitting motionless for a few more minutes, then left as well. Morrison returned to the station where Ramirez was waiting for him. They're obviously concerned, he said, showing her the pictures. Cortez told her about my visit. What's our next move? Ramirez asked. We still don't have direct evidence that Lambert was involved in the murder. We know the motive. Emily was gathering dirt on her stepmother. We know Lambert had access to rare toxic substances through forensic testing. Now we need to locate her the night of the murder. She said she was at home with her husband. He confirms it. Check traffic cam footage around their house in Emily's neighborhood. Get her cell phone geolocation data. Already did. Lambert's phone was at her house all night. But here's the interesting thing. Around the same time Emily died, a camera at the intersection near her house caught a car that looks like the Lambert family's second car, the one Robert usually uses. So he could have lied to cover for his wife? Morrison wondered. Or he was involved, Ramirez suggested. Maybe they were working together. Emily was a threat to the family's reputation. That doesn't sound like Robert. He's genuinely grieving for his daughter. Morrison shook his head. But it's worth checking. Let's look at the last few days of Emily's life. Who she was seeing, where she was going, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Margaret sat behind the wheel of a parked car, nervously tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. Across from her in the passenger seat, Ryan Cortez looked equally anxious. Are you sure he doesn't know anything? She asked, lowering her voice. No, but he obviously suspects something. Showed me pictures of us together, said Emily was following us. Margaret covered her eyes. I knew she was up to something. She hadn't been herself the last few months, constantly asking questions about my old cases, about the foundation. What do we do if the police keep digging? Calm down, Margaret said firmly. They have nothing but speculation, no direct evidence. I'll talk to the district attorney. He'll hold the investigation. And if he doesn't? If they find the phone? Margaret's eyes narrowed. You got rid of it, didn't you? Yes, of course I did, but technology is so advanced now. If they check the calls... Don't panic, Margaret cut him off abruptly. We've thought of everything. Your alibi for the night she died is airtight. Mine too. They can't prove anything. What about Robert? Won't he suspect? My husband is too grief-stricken to suspect anything. He can't see beyond his own nose. Ryan shook his head. It was risky, Margaret. We could have found another way out. What was it? She asked coldly. Let her ruin my career? Everything I've spent decades building? She wouldn't stop, you know that. She'd gather evidence, prepare an appeal to the ethics committee. Then everything would have come out. Our relationship, the conviction, the funding. We'd both be behind bars. I know, Ryan said quietly. It's just, she was young. She had her whole life ahead of her. Don't lecture me. Margaret's eyes glittered. You're in this as much as I am. If I fall, you'll fall with me. They were silent, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Finally, Ryan opened the door. I'll contact you tomorrow. Be careful. That detective, Morrison, he's not the type to be easily led off the trail. I know his type, Margaret grinned. Stubborn, overconfident, thinks they can change the world, but the system is stronger, and I'm part of that system. Cortez got out of the car and caught a cab and drove away. Margaret sat for a few more minutes, then turned on the engine. The main thing now was to leave no trace, to keep her emotions under control. She wouldn't let everything she'd accomplished come crashing down because of a nosy stepdaughter and a stubborn detective. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In Captain Brown's office, Morrison faced not only his superior, but also District Attorney David Hartman. James, the captain nodded dryly. Attorney Hartman is concerned about the progress of the Emily Lambert investigation. What do you mean? Morrison frowned. In the sense that you're questioning a federal judge and her entourage without probable cause, Hartman said stiffly. Margaret Lambert is a respected member of the judiciary. You can't tarnish her reputation without hard evidence. I have reason to believe that there is an illicit relationship between Judge Lambert and ex-convict Ryan Cortez, Morrison countered, and that Emily discovered the affair, which was the motive for her murder. It's all speculation, Hartman dismissed. Circumstantial evidence, speculation. Judge Lambert called me this morning. She's extremely concerned about your methods. She is? Morrison's eyes narrowed. It's interesting that she found out so quickly about my conversation with Cortez. They're obviously in close contact. That's enough, detective, the captain interrupted. I'm not taking you off the case, but I demand a more careful approach. No questioning of Judge Lambert without my authorization. Yes, sir. Morrison held back his irritation. May I go now? As he left the office, the detective felt his resolve growing. If even the district attorney was interfering, he was on the right track. Margaret Lambert had motive, opportunity, and means. Now irrefutable evidence must be found. Back in his office, Morrison found Ramirez with new information. I've traced all of the unknown number's contacts with Emily's cell phone over the last month, she said. 3 more calls, all short, less than a minute. And look at the geolocation of that phone during the calls. A map with markings popped up on the computer screen. Near the courthouse, not far from the Lambert house, and... Morrison looked at a third point. Near the New Beginnings office where Cortez works. Exactly. Someone was watching everyone involved in this story and coordinating by phone. Rain pounded on the windows of the police station. Morrison sat at his desk, piled with folders and printouts. It had been 2 weeks since the discovery of Emily Lambert's body, but it seemed to the detective that time was flying by at an incredible speed. Each day brought them closer to a clue, but at the same time the pressure from their superiors and the district attorney was getting stronger. Here, Ramirez placed a new folder in front of him. The text finally cracked the encrypted part of Emily's computer. And it's interesting. Morrison opened the folder. Inside were printouts of email messages between Emily and her stepmother, correspondence they hadn't publicized. He glanced cursorily through the first few pages, then stopped at one message. Margaret, I know about your meetings with him. I have proof. We need to talk. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. at my house, Emily. The message was sent the day before she died. There was no response from Margaret, at least not in this communication channel. This is it, Morrison said quietly. A direct confrontation. Emily had challenged her stepmother to a conversation, and from what happened, it didn't go according to plan, Ramirez added grimly. Morrison continued to study the materials. The technicians found even earlier messages that Emily had written to herself in notes, a sort of investigative diary. Saw her again today with the same man, took some photos, checked through court records. It's definitely Ryan Cortez. She tried his case 3 years ago and gave him a surprisingly lenient sentence. Coincidence? I don't think so. Followed them to his apartment. They spent 2 hours there. When she came out, they kissed. I have a picture of it. It's clear it's not just a professional relationship. Learned more about the New Beginnings funding. Margaret is using the fund to legalize money transfers to Cortez. That explains where he gets the money for his expensive apartment and car. I can't believe she's so unscrupulous. Always taught me honesty, ethics, respect for the law, and herself. Her whole career is one big lie. The last entry was made 3 days before her death. I can't keep quiet anymore. What she's doing is a crime. A violation of judicial ethics, maybe even corruption. I have to talk to her, give her a chance to explain herself. If she refuses, I'll have to go to the ethics committee. Dad will be crushed, but the truth is more important. Morrison closed the folder. Blackmail? More like an ultimatum, Ramirez objected. Emily wasn't asking for money or other favors. She wanted her stepmother to end her relationship with Cortez and possibly resign. Which was worse than any blackmail for Margaret, Morrison nodded. Her career, her reputation, her power all at stake. A sufficient motive for murder? More than enough. Now we have proof that Emily set up a meeting with her stepmother the night she died, and that she threatened to expose herself. But we still don't have direct evidence linking Margaret to the poison in the wine, Ramirez reminded her. We need to check her access to forensic labs. This rare toxin. Maybe it was used in some case she was working on? Ramirez nodded. I'll contact the experts. What about the phone that called Emily before she died? Let's keep looking. Margaret's smart, but she's not omnipotent. There's got to be a mistake somewhere. Morrison's team worked almost non-stop for the next 3 days. They checked all the surveillance tapes, interviewed Emily's neighbors, looked into Margaret and Ryan Cortez's financial transactions. Little by little, the puzzle was coming together. The lab confirmed the toxin found in the wine was indeed rare and had been used as evidence in one of the high-profile cases Margaret had tried 2 years ago. As a federal judge, she had access to the evidence room. Imagine that, Morrison Ramirez said, reviewing the expert report. She knew of the existence of the perfect, nearly undetectable poison, knew where to get it, and when it became necessary to get rid of Emily. But how did she switch the wine? Ramirez asked. Robert bought the bottle. Remember he said that Margaret had asked him to buy the wine as a gift for Emily? She took the bottle herself on the day of the murder. She could have easily spiked it with poison before the visit. Ramirez thought, we need to do a forensic analysis to see if she could have discreetly added the toxin to an already opened bottle without leaving a trace. The experiment confirmed that with some skill, it was possible. The poison, mixed with a small amount of the same wine, could be injected into the bottle through a thin needle without breaking the cork. Most importantly, the toxin did not change the color or smell of the wine. A perfect crime, the expert observed. If it hadn't been for a targeted toxicological examination, we would never have discovered the poison. So Margaret goes to Emily's house, ostensibly to talk, Morrison reasoned. She brings a bottle of wine as a gesture of reconciliation. They open it, pour it. Emily takes a sip and dies a few minutes later. Margaret calmly walks away, sure it looks like an accident. But why did Emily drink the wine if she was confrontational? Ramirez asked. Perhaps the stepmother skillfully played on their relationship. She said something like, let's talk calmly, like adults, or I'll explain everything. Emily wanted to hear excuses before she acted. Ramirez nodded. A young, inexperienced girl against a matronly judge used to manipulating people in the courtroom. An unequal matchup. Morrison stood up. It's time to talk to Margaret Lambert. Officially on the record. We've got enough circumstantial evidence to corner her. The captain won't approve, Ramirez reminded him. He wanted discretion with the judge. To hell with discretion. The girl's dead, and the killer's on the loose. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Margaret Lambert sat in the interrogation room, impeccably dressed and perfectly calm. In front of her was a folder of documents, materials for the upcoming trial, which she had to postpone because of an urgent meeting with the police. Sitting next to her was her attorney, the renowned lawyer Richard Dunn. "Detective Morrison," she nodded coldly as he entered the room. "I hope you have a good reason to keep a federal judge from her work?" "Very good reasons, Your Honor," Morrison replied, sitting down across from her. "The murder of your stepdaughter." "I've already answered all your questions, several times." "Yes, but we have new information." Morrison opened his folder. "For example, we've discovered correspondence between you and Emily. In particular, her last message to you, an invitation to meet the night she died." Margaret's face remained unmoved. "I didn't receive such a message." "That's odd, because it was sent to your personal email account, the same one you used to communicate with Emily earlier. Maybe it went to spam." "What about the fact that Emily was gathering evidence of your connection to Ryan Cortez?" Morrison spread the photos out on the table. "There's you kissing outside his apartment. That's you handing him an envelope in the park. Here you are walking into a hotel together." The lawyer put his hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Judge Lambert is not obliged to comment on her private life." "I agree," Morrison nodded. "If this were simply an affair, but here we're dealing with a conflict of interest. The judge is in a relationship with a man who received an unreasonably lenient sentence, funds the organization where he works, and when the stepdaughter threatens to expose that relationship—" "That's speculation, Detective," Margaret interrupted coldly. "You have no proof that I met with Emily that night." "You're right. There's no direct evidence," Morrison agreed. "But there's a string of circumstantial ones. You had motive. Emily threatened to ruin your career. You had opportunity. Your husband confirmed that you planned to visit Emily and took one of the bottles of wine he'd bought. And you had access to a rare poison found in the victim's body. All of this is circumstantial evidence," the lawyer interjected, switching to English. "Any court would dismiss such charges." Morrison smiled. "Then explain this." He laid a new document on the table. "The forensic results of the lipstick traces found on Emily's glass. It matches the branded lipstick you use. Color, chemical composition, a perfect match." Margaret tensed slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I've been to Emily's before. I could have drank from the same glass at a different time." "What about this one?" Morrison pulled out another document. "Traffic cam footage outside Emily's house. A car registered in your name parked 2 blocks from her house. The time is 8:30 p.m., the day she died. I wasn't driving. My husband—" "Your husband was in a business meeting across town at the time. We have witness statements and restaurant security footage." Margaret was silent. Her lawyer leaned over to her, whispered something in her ear. She shook her head faintly. "And finally," Morrison laid out his final trump card, "the burner phone used to call Emily before she died. We found it. It was a bluff. They hadn't found the phone yet. But Margaret's reaction was worth the risk. Her hand, resting on the table, shook faintly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Her voice remained steady. "The phone was found in a dumpster 3 blocks from your house. There are fingerprints on it. You're familiar with court procedure, Your Honor. We'll take a sample of your fingerprints for comparison, if they match." "That's absurd," Counselor intervened. "You can't compel a federal judge to—" "I can," Morrison said firmly, "with a warrant signed by the chief judge of the district, which, by the way, is on its way. A bluff on a bluff." But the psychological pressure was working. Margaret was visibly pale. "I demand that this interrogation cease," the lawyer said. "My client will not answer any further questions without—" "That's enough, Richard," Margaret said, suddenly calm. There was silence in the room. "You're a smart man, Detective Morrison." Margaret looked him straight in the eye. "But not as smart as you think you are. Yes, I dated Ryan Cortez. Yes, we had a relationship, but I didn't kill Emily." "Prove it," Morrison said simply. "I did go to see her that night. We talked. She showed me pictures, threatened to expose me. I suggested we drink wine, talk things over. And you slipped me poison." "No, I left before she opened the bottle. We had a fight. I told her I wasn't afraid of her threats, that I had enough connections to survive a scandal. She was furious. I left. And half an hour later she was dead. A coincidence?" Morrison asked skeptically. "Detective, I'm not a murderer. Margaret's voice sounded firm. Yes, I violated professional ethics. Yes, I'm guilty of a conflict of interest, but I would never kill. And how do you explain the lipstick on the glass? We were both drinking water when I got here, from the same glass. Maybe the experts got it mixed up. Morrison shook his head. It doesn't add up, Judge Lambert. All the evidence points to you. Evidence can be interpreted in many ways, she argued. You're basing the prosecution's case on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. Then let's check your fingerprints on the phone. If they don't match, I'll apologize. Margaret froze for a moment, then asked quietly, And what's in danger of happening to me? Theoretically. The lawyer tried to stop her, but she gestured to silence him. First-degree murder, Morrison replied. Given the premeditation, the aggravating circumstances, and your status as an agent of the law, it's life in prison without parole. What if it wasn't premeditated, if it was in a moment of passion? Then second-degree murder, 25 years with the possibility of parole in 15. Morrison leaned forward. Is there something you want to tell me, Judge Lambert? Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were tired and relieved. I didn't plan to kill her, she said quietly. It came out spontaneous. Miss Lambert, I strongly advise you to keep quiet, the lawyer interjected. Anything you say? Shut up, Richard, Margaret said sharply. I'm tired of these lies. She turned to Morrison. I did come to talk. I brought the wine as a gesture of reconciliation, but Emily wouldn't listen to me. She showed me the photos, said she'd send them to the Ethics Commission tomorrow morning, that my career was over, that I wasn't worthy to wear the mantle of judge. Margaret took a deep breath. I begged her to think about the consequences, how it would break her father's heart. But she was adamant, she said. She said she'd always despised me, that I was a hypocrite, pretending to be a paragon of virtue when in fact I was a whore sleeping with a criminal. There was pain in her voice. We opened the wine. I remembered the poison. I had access to the evidence locker. I took some a few days ago. I didn't know why. Maybe I was subconsciously preparing. It was with me, in my purse. When Emily turned away from her computer to show me more evidence, I put it in her glass. Did you realize what you were doing? Morrison asked. Not fully. It was a moment of, a blur. 30 years of a flawless career, my whole life, and it all comes crashing down because of a stupid affair and an overconfident girl. When did she drink? Almost immediately. She said, for justice, with such wicked irony. A few minutes later, she started to feel sick. She looked at me and she understood. All she said was, "You're really ready for anything, aren't you?" And then she collapsed. I checked for a pulse. She was gone. Margaret looked devastated. I wiped the glass, the bottle, the doorknobs. I left. I threw away my gloves and the phone I called her from before I came in. Why did you call her? Morrison asked. I wanted to make sure she was home alone. Said I'd stop by to talk to her. The lawyer grabbed her arm. That's enough, Margaret. Don't say another word. But it was too late. Morrison turned on the tape recorder lying on the table. Please repeat your confession for the record. Margaret looked at the lawyer, then at the detective, and nodded weakly. I, Margaret Lambert, admit that I poisoned my stepdaughter, Emily Lambert, in a state of passion on the evening of October 22nd. I am compelled to detain you on the charge of murder, Morrison said formally. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. He continued to read out the rights, and Margaret sat motionless, staring into the void in front of her. A glittering career, power, reputation, all gone in an instant. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. News of a federal judge's arrest on charges of murdering his stepdaughter exploded in the media. Judge Lambert poisoned stepdaughter over secret affair, corruption and murder at the highest echelons of the judiciary, Themis without a bandage, the shocking case of Margaret Lambert, screamed the headlines. Morrison watched this media frenzy with mixed feelings. A week after Margaret's arrest, he visited Robert Lambert in his empty house. The man looked 10 years older. I still can't believe it, Detective. My daughter, my wife. I'm sorry, sir, Morrison said sincerely. No one deserves this. You know what the worst part is? Robert grinned bitterly. If Emily had come to me, told me of her suspicions, I probably wouldn't have believed it. I thought Margaret was the ideal of justice, and she... He didn't finish the sentence. "What's going to happen to Cortez?" he asked after a minute. He was arrested too. Corruption charges, abuse of parole. Not murder, but he'll be behind bars for years. Robert nodded. Emily had always been principled, even as a child. Never tolerated injustice. His voice trembled. Maybe too principled for this world. "She was a brave girl," Morrison said. "Not everyone dares to stand up to such a powerful person, even if it's a family member." The next day, Morrison attended Margaret Lambert's preliminary hearing. She appeared in the courtroom, not in a judge's robe, but in a prison robe. A former federal judge, now a defendant charged with first-degree murder. When the judge asked if she would plead guilty, Margaret replied in a firm voice, "Guilty of manslaughter." The prosecutor disagreed and demanded a trial on the more serious charge. The judge set a date for the trial to begin. That evening, Morrison sat in his office, poring over photographs from the case. Snapshots of Emily, the evidence she had collected, shots of Margaret in the courtroom. Justice had been served, but there was no joy. Only bitterness at the realization of how easily power and ambition could corrupt even those who were supposed to stand guard over the law. Ramirez peeked through the door. "You're off the case?" "Yes." He gathered the photos back into the folder. "The commissioner's happy. DA's not so happy, lost a valuable ally in Lambert." "You solved a high-profile case. Promotion coming up?" Morrison shrugged. "That's not the point. It's not about career." "What is?" "Justice," he said simply. "The law should be the same for everyone, regardless of position or connections. Otherwise, this whole thing," he pointed to the police station, "doesn't make sense." The phone rang on Morrison's desk, a new case demanding attention. Life went on. Justice, though sometimes blind and imperfect, continued. And Margaret Lambert's story will be a warning to others. No power or position guarantees impunity. Sooner or later, the truth comes out.